What if the moment that changes your entire life arrives not in a boardroom or a chapel, but on a rain-slicked street when you're too tired to hide your tears? Grace Whittaker was a woman the world barely noticed, a secretary buried in bills, carrying the weight of guardianship for her young nephew. Ethan Pierce was a millionaire CEO, polished and untouchable, a man who believed precision could shield him from grief. Two people on opposite ends of power, both bound by quiet losses. One night, beneath the storm-lit glass of Seattle's waterfront, their paths collided, a kiss in the rain, unplanned, undeniable, and captured by a silent camera set off a chain of choices neither could escape. Was it weakness, or was it the first step toward healing? Could love survive the scrutiny of a company, the cruelty of whispers, and the heavy pull of old wounds? This is not a story of glamour. It is a story of storms, of second chances, and of finding light where the world says you should not look. Stay with us and ask yourself, what would you choose: success, reputation, or the courage to be real? If this journey speaks to you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the story as it unfolds. Seattle woke under rain again, the kind that drummed on every roof and hissed against the sidewalks as if the whole city were one vast shoreline. Grace Whittaker pressed her palm flat on a stack of unopened mail before sliding the top envelope into her purse. The letterhead was familiar. Hospital Finance. She had seen too many of those. The bold red type on the corner, past due, was almost becoming part of her morning routine. She tucked it away before Owen could see, though the 10-year-old was already at school, sketching his lighthouses in the margins of his math sheets. By the time she reached the Pierce Harbor Tower, her shoes were damp, and her coat smelled faintly of wool gone wet. The lobby glowed with nautical models, schooners under glass, maps of storm tracks on the Pacific, brass plaques celebrating shipping milestones. People hurried past them without a glance. Grace slowed for a heartbeat, staring at a hurricane path marked in thick red ink. She thought about how storms were charted and named, while lives like hers, lives caught in quiet tempests, moved invisibly through the corridors. The security guard waved her in with the kind politeness reserved for someone seen daily, yet hardly noticed. She smiled back, though the gesture never reached her eyes. The legal suite on the 8th floor greeted her with the hum of fluorescent lights and the soft rattle of an aging heater. She set her purse under her desk, placed Owen's school form in a plastic sleeve so it wouldn't crease, and pinned a faded postcard above her monitor. The image showed a lighthouse in Maine, a place her sister had once dreamed of visiting. The edges were curled from years of tape, but Grace kept it there as a compass, a reminder that promises mattered even when the sea rose high. Coffee cooled beside her keyboard. The second cup of the day, though, it tasted like the bottom of a forgotten pot. Around her, phones rang, heels clicked, laughter rose and fell like waves. She typed steadily, cataloging contracts, formatting briefs, preparing filings that few would ever read, but all demanded on time. When she paused to stretch her fingers, she caught her reflection in the darkened window, hair pulled back without care, glasses sliding, blouse a shade too faded. In that glass, she looked transparent, as if the city beyond might swallow her whole. At noon, colleagues gathered in the break room, voices buoyant with weekend plans. Grace waited until the crowd dispersed before slipping inside. She unwrapped a sandwich left from yesterday, edges curled dry, and ate in silence. No one asked to join her. No one noticed the way she held the bread as though it were rationed. The guardianship forms weighed heavier than the sandwich. The court wanted proof she could provide stability for Owen. Stability was a word written on official paper, measured in income and assets. It was not measured in the nights she sat with him during storms, explaining that thunder was only clouds clashing. It was not measured in the stories she read by the yellow lamp when fear kept him awake. Still, she folded the papers neatly and slid them back into her purse, promising herself she would find the numbers somehow. Afternoon dragged into gray. Rain streaked the tall glass panes, each drop a thread pulling the skyline down. Grace buried herself in filings, grateful for numbers and statutes that did not ask her to smile. Yet beneath her steady motions, Anxiety swelled. She felt it first as a tremor in her hand, then as a tightness in her chest. The room tilted slightly, the way it had after her sister's funeral, when she had tried to stand too soon. She rose quickly, clutching a stack of papers, and walked toward the copy machine. Its grinding whir filled the air, masking the sound of her uneven breath. She pressed her palm flat against the counter, willing her heart to slow. The panic pressed in like water against glass, invisible to everyone else. When the machine spat out warm pages, she shuffled them calmly, her face composed. No one would know, not today. By 7, the suite was empty, but for her. She corrected a line of text no one would notice, replaced a comma, recalculated a filing fee. Her eyes burned, yet she stayed until the last document was sealed in its folder. Work was a raft. As long as she kept rowing, she would not sink. She shut down the computer, collected her purse, and slipped the lighthouse postcard into the side pocket. Outside, the storm had grown fierce. Rain slashed sideways against the glass, blurring the waterfront lights into smears of gold and white. The ferry horn sounded in the distance, low and mournful, echoing through the steel and glass like a call meant only for her. Grace stood at the window a long moment, forehead resting against the cool pane. She could call a cab. She could wait beneath the awning until the rain eased. But something in her chest resisted. Money was too tight for indulgence, and waiting never changed the weather. So, she squared her shoulders, wrapped her damp coat tighter, and stepped into the elevator. Each floor ticked down with a hollow chime. By the time the doors opened, the sound of the storm filled the lobby. She crossed past the model ships, past the storm maps that looked almost alive under fluorescent light, and pushed through the revolving doors. The rain met her instantly, soaking hair and fabric in a heartbeat. It was cold, yes, but honest. It hid her weariness and her unshed tears, the ones she had buried beneath copy machines and legal briefs. The ferry horn echoed again, louder this time, as if the bay itself had chosen her. Grace lifted her face to the storm and began the long walk home. Ethan Pierce leaned back in his chair, fountain pen balanced between his fingers, as the rain blurred Elliott Bay into a gray wall beyond the glass. The city's horizon was gone, replaced by shifting sheets of water that erased every line. He welcomed the erasure. A clean surface made it easier to focus. The contracts in front of him demanded precision, and precision was something he could trust. His mornings began with order black coffee in a porcelain mug, news folded into neat thirds, calendar blocks arranged to the quarter hour. He dressed the same way everyday tailored suit, silver tie clip, polished shoes that caught the elevator light. The building mirrored his discipline, glass and steel polished until no fingerprints dared remain. Pierce Harbor logistics thrived on predictability. The board preferred it that way. Numbers steady, public image tidy, dividends secure. Ethan understood their appetite for caution, though he felt the walls of it tightening. His expansion plan, pushing into cross-Pacific freight lines, required a bolder risk. It was the kind of gamble that could triple their influence or expose every crack in their foundation. He knew the vote would be close. Still, he moved through the day with controlled gestures, no wasted words, no visible hesitation. Staff responded to that kind of clarity, even if they never glimpsed the man beneath. To most, he was the figure behind the glass, voice precise, expression cool, a presence that filled the room without revealing warmth. But there were cracks no one saw. In the top drawer of his desk rested a folded note on lined paper, written in a looping hand that shook in places. It was good to see you today. Ethan, the roses were lovely. Don't let the rain keep you inside. Love, Mom. She had written it on one of her clearer mornings at the memory care home. He carried it with him, tucking it into his jacket pocket before meetings, as though the fragile words could anchor him. What he never opened anymore were the letters on the shelf behind him, decades of thank yous from employees and families he had helped, tucked neatly into cream envelopes. At first he had read each one, grateful for connection. Over time, he stopped. Gratitude hurt more than distance. Distance kept him steady. Every Thursday evening, after the boardroom emptied, Ethan drove to see his mother. He brought roses when he could, sometimes tulips in spring. She was often quiet, lost to corridors of her mind he could not enter. But once in a while she returned, sudden and bright. She would recall his father's laugh, or the first ferry ride he had taken as a boy. Those moments pierced him, both gift and wound. He never stayed too long. If he stayed, the leaving became unbearable. His secretary knocked lightly at noon, delivering a folder marked Employee Relief Fund. It was a small program, not advertised, designed for hardship cases. Most executives treated it as a nuisance, a line item to skim. Ethan reviewed every page. He scanned requests for medical bills, funeral expenses, rent support after disasters. The numbers were small compared to their revenues, yet each one carried the weight of a life pressed thin. That afternoon, he paused over a request from a junior analyst whose wife had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. The man's words were sparse, almost embarrassed, but the need was clear. Ethan held the page longer than usual, the rain hammering the windows behind him. For a moment he considered the board's warnings about optics, how generosity might be perceived as favoritism. Then he signed his name with deliberate strokes. Some things did not need debate. On his way back from the break room, mug steaming, he noticed a figure moving quickly down the hall, hair pinned in a loose knot, shoulders hunched beneath a damp blazer. He knew her only as one of dozens in the legal department, her face rarely lifted from her desk. She passed without looking up. He filed her shape away without thought, just another motion in the blur of the office. By 5, meetings stacked high on his calendar had drained to silence. His expansion proposal was due for review next month. He had refined the numbers, trimmed every argument, prepared for resistance. Yet he felt the hum of unease under his ribs. Risk was math, but it was also reputation, and reputation was fragile as glass. He set his pen aside, closed the contracts, and rose. Outside, the storm intensified, streaking the glass with rivulets that caught the light like quicksilver. He pressed the elevator button and waited, watching the city vanish behind a veil of rain. The doors opened with a chime, and he stepped inside, the reflection of steel and storm closing around him. As the elevator descended, he let the day's mask slip for a heartbeat. The penance of order, the comfort of control, the fragile note in his pocket, none of it changed the truth. Beneath the glass, he was still a man tethered by love and loss, moving through a world that mistook discipline for coldness. The doors slid open on the ground floor, releasing him into the lobby's glow. He did not notice the secretary stepping into the same weather a few minutes later. The storm belonged to both of them, though neither yet knew. Night had already settled by the time Grace left the legal suite. The rest of the floor was dark. Empty cubicles stretched like a hollow grid. Only her desk lamp burned, its light pooling over stacks of filings she had reorganized twice. The heater hummed against the window's steady drumbeat of rain. She gathered the last folder, hugging it against her chest as though paper could shield her from the weight of bills, school notices, and the persistent fear that she was falling behind. Her nephew's permission slip for a field trip peeked from her bag, safely sealed in a plastic sleeve. She had promised him he could go, though the fee still sat unpaid. The building's lobby glowed faintly when she reached it. A ship model in a glass case caught the light, its sails stiff with polish, forever stuck mid-voyage. The guard nodded absently, already absorbed in his late-night crossword. Outside, the crosswalk shimmered under street lamps. Grace stepped into the storm. The wind shoved her hair loose, water slipping down her neck. She pulled her coat tighter, but the fabric was too thin, its lining worn. The rain struck with a cold persistence, soaking her shoes as she crossed toward the ferry terminal. By the corner, her strength collapsed. 5 months of balancing guardianship hearings, late fees, and endless office hours came crashing in. Her chest tightened. She pressed the folder hard against her ribs. Tears mingled with rain until she could no longer tell them apart. The sound of the city dimmed into one sharp cry from the ferry horn, echoing through her like a summons. She leaned against the terminal wall, trembling, hiding her face from the few pedestrians who hurried past with umbrellas angled like shields. A car door slammed nearby. Ethan Pierce had just left a donor dinner for the company's relief fund. He should have gone straight home. But the storm slowed traffic, and something drew him to pause near the terminal. His eyes, trained by habit to scan details, caught the sight of a lone woman crumpled by the rain. At first she was only a silhouette, shoulders bent, folder clutched like a lifeline. Then she lifted her face, and in the glow of the streetlight he saw her tears. Not polished grief, not contained sorrow, but raw ache, the kind he carried in his own pocket with his mother's note. Something inside him broke. This was not boardrooms or balance sheets. This was a human being stripped bare by weather and loss. He crossed the street before he could remind himself of distance or protocol. Grace sensed movement and looked up, startled. Through the veil of rain stood Ethan Pierce, the man behind the glass. His immaculate suit now plastered dark against him. Water ran down his jaw, over the steady set of his mouth. She should have turned away. He should have walked past. Instead, the storm bound them in a fragile circle, sound muted to the hiss of tires and the beat of rain on pavement. "I see you," he murmured, words nearly swallowed by the storm. Grace blinked, unable to speak. Her pulse raced, confusion and shame colliding with the unshakable relief of being noticed. And then, without plan or permission, Ethan reached, cupping her face with wet hands, and kissed her. It was not the practiced kiss of a man who calculated outcomes. It was messy, rain-salted, desperate. The world dissolved into the press of lips, the taste of storm, the startling warmth of contact. Her folder slipped to the curb, pages darkening in the puddle. For one impossible moment, time stopped. The ache in Grace's chest eased. The hollow in Ethan's heart filled with something fierce and alive. Above them, unnoticed, a small red light blinked. The security camera over the doorway recorded in silence, impartial to the miracle below. They broke apart as quickly as the moment had come. Breathless, wide-eyed, neither trusted the reality of what had just happened. The rain poured harder, as if to seal the secret into their skin. Grace stepped back, hands shaking. Ethan lowered his gaze, the weight of his choice crashing in. Neither spoke. Words would have diminished the truth of what they had shared. Another horn bellowed from the ferry. A bus splashed through the crosswalk. Life insisted on moving, even as their world had shifted. She stooped to gather her soaked folder, clutching it like armor once more. He stood motionless, rain streaking down his face like tears he would not name. When their eyes met again, both carried the same silent recognition something had begun that neither could undo. The storm did not let up. They parted in opposite directions, stunned, changed, unsure of the cost. Behind them, the red light continued to blink, recording not just a kiss, but the fragile beginning of everything that would follow. The office smelled of wet wool and printer toner. Umbrellas leaned crooked against filing cabinets, dripping onto the carpet. Grace walked quickly, head down, careful to keep her steps measured. Her hair was still damp from the storm, despite the towel she had used at home. She avoided the executive hallway. The memory of last night clung to her, impossible to fold away like soaked clothes. She pressed her bag closer to her side, as though holding herself steady. In her drawer, she tucked the ferry schedule, still wrinkled from the rain, a reminder she could not look at too long. At her desk, files waited in their neat stacks. She smoothed the edges, grateful for tasks that did not ask questions. The copy machine whirred behind her, covering the sound of her quickened breath. No one in the office knew. No one could know. Ethan kept his distance. She sensed him once in the hallway, the shift of air when he passed, but he did not look at her. His voice carried in brief, clipped phrases during meetings, the same voice as always. Only once did their eyes meet through glass. It lasted a second, enough to make her chest ache. By late morning, she ducked into the break room. The smell of burnt coffee lingered. On the counter sat a silver thermos, steam curling from its lid. A note taped to the side read, "Simply for you." She looked around, heart pounding. No one lingered. She touched the thermos as if it might vanish. The metal was warm. Unscrewing the cap, she found soup, fragrant and rich, the kind she had not tasted in weeks. Her pride resisted. She should not take charity. She had survived on half meals before, but the scent weakened her resolve. She poured a little into a cup, hands trembling. The heat spread through her chest, steadying her. That afternoon she sifted through case files, between contracts and affidavits. She noticed something unexpected. A slip of paper had been misfiled Owen's lighthouse sketch. He must have tucked it into her folder the night before. Pencil lines showed a tall tower with beams stretching over waves. Beside it, he had written, "Someday we'll go." She swallowed hard, sliding the sketch back where it would not be seen. When she lifted her gaze, she found Ethan across the hall. He had paused, file in hand, eyes flicking toward her desk. For a breath, she thought he had seen the drawing, seen too much. Then he moved on, expression unreadable. Small kindnesses followed over the next days. An anonymous meal card left under her keyboard. A bus pass tucked into her mailbox. She never saw who placed them, though her heart knew. Each gesture tightened the knot of gratitude and pride inside her. She wanted to say, "Thank you." She wanted to refuse. Lunchtime came. Her stomach growled, louder than she wished. She opened the thermos again, pouring a full cup this time. The soup was still warm, as though waiting for her. She ate slowly, savoring each spoonful, letting the strength return to her body. It was the first real lunch she had eaten in days. Not vending machine crackers, not cold coffee, but food that nourished. She felt almost guilty for how much it comforted her. The office buzzed on, co-workers chattering about weekend plans. Grace sat quiet in her corner, thermos beside her, heart both heavy and light. She knew gossip could destroy her if anyone guessed, but she also knew they could not erase what had happened. She would not pretend the kiss had been nothing, and she would not let whispers define her. Her decision was silent, made only to herself. She folded the napkin carefully, placed the thermos back in its bag, and slid it into her drawer. There it stayed, a secret anchor, hidden yet known. When the day ended, rain tapped gently against the windows once more. Grace reached for her coat. Her eyes lingered on the drawer, then closed softly. The thermos remained, waiting like a promise she did not yet understand. On her kitchen counter, Grace lined up orange pill bottles like sentinels. The labels were faded, but she kept them. Each bore her sister's name, each a fragment of the last month when medicine felt like hope. She could not throw them away. They were proof that love had tried, even if love had failed. She rinsed a mug and set it beside the bottles. The apartment was quiet, Owen already asleep in the next room. His school backpack leaned against the chair, a lighthouse drawn in marker across the front pocket. He sketched them everywhere, tall towers against the sea, beams cutting through night. On the fridge hung the postcard she had promised him they would visit. Portland Head Light, its white walls bright against blue water. Her sister had found it once in a tourist rack, long before illness consumed her. She had pressed it into Grace's hand. "Take him there someday," she had whispered. Grace had nodded, though she had no savings, no travel plans, no map for how. The promise remained, taped to the fridge, a beacon she had not yet reached. Bills waited in a folder on the counter, due dates circled in red, guardianship paperwork stacked beside them, signatures still needed, hearings still scheduled. Grace touched the edges, remembering courtrooms where she had stood alone, clutching documents as if they could defend her. She had learned to keep her chin steady while answering questions meant to measure her worth as a guardian. Each time she left with a new deadline and a deeper exhaustion. Across the city, Ethan unfolded a note from his mother. Her handwriting wandered, letters uneven, but the words glowed. "You were my bright boy. Don't forget the ferry rides. I still hear the gulls." He held the paper carefully, as though touch might wear the ink away. Her lucid days were fewer now, each one a treasure wrapped in ache. He remembered her laughter, her sharp wit, the way she had once balanced checkbooks with perfect precision. Now he sat at her bedside, feeding her soup, reminding her of names she had given him. The reversal hollowed him. On his shelf were files marked medical authorization, power of attorney, memory care agreement. He knew the language of decline as intimately as Grace knew the language of debt. Different battles, same vocabulary of loss. When they spoke quietly, always quietly, they discovered the overlap. She mentioned insurance forms, the hold music of hospitals, the way kindness sometimes arrived too late. He nodded, adding stories of signatures on documents he had never wanted to sign. They did not pity each other. They recognized endurance. Grace confessed one evening, voice low, that she feared leaning on anyone. Every time she had let go, something collapsed. Her sister's health, her own sleep, the small pile of savings she had once guarded. Dependence felt like weakness, and weakness carried consequences. Ethan listened, steady. Control had been his armor for years. He mistook it for safety, but in her words, he heard a mirror. Perhaps his refusal to lean had cost him too, the distance between himself and every person who might have reached through the glass. The realization unsettled him. Control did not protect, it only isolated. And perhaps isolation was the most dangerous wound of all. Their conversations were never long, sometimes no more than a few sentences exchanged in a hallway, sometimes a brief pause in the break room when no one else lingered. But each word carried weight. She did not flatter. He did not command. They simply spoke as two people who knew the shape of endurance. Respect grew in the spaces between their words, not admiration for strength as the world defined it, but recognition of stamina. They saw not weakness in one another, but the quiet devotion that had carried them through nights of unpaid bills and unsigned forms, through rooms where life had slipped away despite every effort. One afternoon, Grace found another note tucked beneath her case files. It was not signed, only written in strong strokes. "You are not alone in this fight." She pressed the paper to her palm, unsure if she wanted to cry or smile. That night, she set the note beside the pill bottles on her counter. Together, they formed a strange altar proof of what love had endured, and proof that endurance could still be seen. Ethan, in his own home, returned his mother's note to the drawer and sat in silence. He thought of Grace, of the lighthouse sketches, of promises held in place by tape on a refrigerator door. He wondered when survival had become their common tongue, and why speaking it aloud felt like relief. They did not plan the next step. They only chose, quietly, to keep talking, not to erase what had happened in the rain, not to let gossip dictate the terms, but to walk slowly, word by word, toward something neither had expected. The rain tapped again that night, soft against windows across the city. Grace leaned her forehead against the glass. Ethan did the same, miles away. 2 lives, 2 histories, 1 wound, and perhaps a shared beginning. They missed the ferry. By the time Grace and Ethan reached the terminal, the last passengers had boarded, and the ramp was already rising. The horn sounded once, deep and final, before the vessel pulled away from the dock. Neither of them minded. They were still laughing, breath visible in the cool air, socks wet from puddles they had failed to avoid. The storm had calmed to a drizzle, drops shining on the brim of Ethan's coat. Grace shook her head, smiling in disbelief at the sound of her own laughter. It had been months since anything had broken through the weight of her days. They walked along the waterfront instead, wood planks slick beneath their shoes, gulls restless on the railings. Seattle's skyline glimmered behind the curtain of rain. Each light reflected twice on the water. They said little at first, only breathed, letting silence feel less like distance and more like shelter. When Ethan finally spoke, his voice was even. "If we're going to do this," he said, "we do it off the clock. No blurred lines at the office." Grace nodded, relieved. She needed the separation as much as he did. Work was already a maze of whispers and expectations. She could not risk confusing her role with something tender. "Off the clock," she echoed. The phrase steadied her, like a post driven into shifting ground. They paused under the awning of a closed shop. Ethan pulled a small card from his pocket and held it out. It bore the name of a pro bono advocate, someone known for helping guardians through hearings and paperwork. Grace accepted it carefully, fingers brushing his. Her throat tightened. He had not offered her a check, not pity disguised as generosity. He had offered knowledge, connection, something that did not erode her dignity. "I'll meet with them," she said softly. "I can't take money, but this I can accept." His eyes warmed. "Good. That's all I wanted." They resumed walking, rain dampening their hair, though neither noticed much anymore. Grace felt a small weight lift. For the first time, she could imagine facing the next court date without trembling alone. They turned a corner where the waterfront narrowed. A modest cafe stood with its chairs stacked inside, windows fogged from the day's heat. She stopped, pointing. "Here. No one looks twice in a place like that." Ethan followed her gaze. It was nothing fancy. The kind of spot where longshoremen ordered soup before dawn and students refilled their coffee cups until closing. But to Grace, it was safe. To him, it was a door into the ordinary world he had almost forgotten. "Tomorrow," he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "Tomorrow." The word was small, but it carried a vow. Not a promise of forever, not even of certainty, just the courage to try, in daylight, without hiding. They stood in the hush of the pier, watching another ferry's light sweep across the dark water. Beams cut through fog, steady and patient, like Owen's sketches come alive. Grace thought of the postcard taped to her fridge. Ethan thought of his mother's note folded in his pocket. Different anchors, same pull towards something worth keeping. The drizzle thickened again. Grace pulled her coat tighter, but the cold no longer felt unbearable. Ethan offered his umbrella, then lowered it when she shook her head. They let the rain fall on both of them, unhidden, unguarded. No kiss passed between them. What bound them now was deeper than impulse. It was a choice, a deliberate beginning. Two people carrying wounds, agreeing to open a door instead of closing it. They lingered until the next horn sounded in the distance, calling another ferry into port. The storm was already building again, clouds rolling dark across the bay. But Grace felt, for the first time in years, that she had someone to face it with. When they parted, their steps carried different rhythms, but the same direction. Both carried the echo of laughter still warming their chests, the echo of a vow spoken not in grand declarations, but in ordinary words. Tomorrow. It began with a clip, grainy, shaky, pulled from a security feed never meant for the public. Two silhouettes in the rain, a brief press of lips beneath a halo of streetlight. In the corner of the frame, a red light blinked. The video landed first on a small local blog that thrived on gossip about Seattle executives. By noon, it had spread through office phones like spilled ink. Co-workers watched in break rooms, lowering their voices only after Grace walked past. She kept her steps steady, even when whispers trailed behind her like smoke. She had grown used to invisibility. Now she wished for it. Her desk, once a corner of quiet labor, had become a stage. Every phone call, every sigh, every lifted folder carried an audience. By midweek, HR called her in. The representative smiled tightly, papers folded in a neat stack. "We simply need context," the woman said, though her tone made clear that judgment had already arrived. Grace sat upright, palms flat on her skirt. She would not stammer. She would not defend what was hers to keep. When she returned to her desk, Owen's school had left a message on her phone. The principal reported that cameras outside dismissal had caught children teasing him. A grainy clip again. "Your aunt is in trouble," they had said, laughing. He had stood silent, clutching his backpack with the lighthouse drawn across it. Grace pressed her hand to her chest, steadying her breath. For his sake, she had to endure, but the shame was heavy, thick as the storm clouds outside. Robert Kingsley, chair of the board, summoned Ethan to his office. The older man gestured toward a printout of the blog headline. "The morals clause," he said, tapping the paper. "We cannot afford scandal. Not now, not with the expansion vote." Ethan stood stiff, jaw locked. He had faced rivals in shipping lanes, regulators with pens poised, politicians with folded smiles. But this was different. This was an intrusion into something fragile, something not yet spoken aloud. "Is it ethics you care about?" he asked quietly. Or, "Control Kingsley's silence" was answer enough. The next morning, Grace arrived to find an envelope on her desk. Administrative leave pending review. She read the words twice, then a third time, until they blurred. Her hands remained steady, though her stomach turned. She began to pack, a plant that had grown leggy from low light. A mug chipped at the rim, files marked with her handwriting, careful and precise. Her movements were deliberate, each object wrapped as though it mattered. Co-workers avoided her eyes. Some offered faint nods of sympathy, quickly withdrawn. Others whispered even louder, eager to fill silence with speculation. Down the hall, Ethan sat in his office, blinds half drawn. His phone vibrated with messages from investors, journalists, board members demanding statements. His reputation, built on discipline and distance, threatened to crack. One option was silence. The other was care. Silence might preserve his title. Care might preserve his humanity. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his mother's latest note. "Don't let the rain keep you inside." The handwriting wavered, but the intent was clear. He closed his eyes, folded the paper, and set it beside his phone. The security team traced the leak. The footage had not been stolen by a hacker, nor discovered by an employee. It had been sold by a contracted vendor, a faceless company paid to monitor the building after hours. Profit, not integrity, had fueled the scandal. Control, not ethics, had guided the board's fury. The realization steadied Ethan. This was not about right or wrong. It was about who held power over narrative, and he refused to surrender his story. He picked up the phone, voice clear. "Call an emergency meeting," he said. "Today." Every member in the room. Meanwhile, Grace placed the last item in her box. Owen's latest sketch, slipped under a paperweight, showed a lighthouse beam cutting through dark rain. She tucked it carefully on top, as if it could light her path out of the building. She lifted the box into her arms. Her steps were slow, but her chin remained high. She would not let them see her break. In the lobby, the guard glanced up from his crossword, offering a brief nod of respect. Grace returned it, grateful for the small mercy. Outside, rain struck the glass in steady rhythm. She tightened her grip on the box and stepped into the storm once more. Grace pressed her badge into the receptionist's hand. The plastic card was cool against her skin, a sliver of identity now severed. She smiled politely, though her throat ached. The elevator doors opened with their usual sigh, and she stepped inside, carrying nothing but her purse. Mirrors lined the walls. They showed a woman with damp hair tucked into a knot, a blouse pressed neatly though her heart was frayed. She studied her own reflection as the elevator descended, floor after floor, until the numbers blurred. This was not surrender, she told herself. This was protection. A child's life would not be pulled into scandal because she clung to pride. Her resignation letter had been brief. It spoke of irreconcilable differences and a desire to preserve stability. What it did not say was that she loved Ethan, and that love made her choice heavier, not lighter. She signed it anyway. The apartment she found 2 weeks later was smaller. 2 rooms, 1 drafty window, second-hand curtains. The thrift store delivered a sagging couch and a table with mismatched chairs. Owen helped her arrange the pieces, laughing when one chair wobbled. Grace tightened the screws herself, determined that nothing else would fall apart. She worked mornings at a temp agency, evenings typing transcripts for a law office across town. Meals were simple pasta, beans, the occasional treat of soup if she stretched the budget right. Still, Owen smiled at her across their tiny table, and she counted that as enough. On the top shelf of her closet sat a memory box. Inside lay the lighthouse postcard, edges soft from years of handling. Beside it rested Ethan's unused check, folded once, never cashed. She had placed it there the night she left, a symbol not of rejection, but of choice. She would not let money dictate her worth. She would not let generosity erase dignity. Some nights, she opened the box, touching the postcard's image of the White Tower against the sea. "Someday," she whispered. The word was more prayer than promise. Across the city. Ethan sat in his truck outside the memory care home. Rain drummed hard against the roof, a steady percussion that matched the weight in his chest. He had visited his mother earlier, bringing roses she no longer recognized. When she smiled faintly, he clung to it, storing it away like light in a dark place. Now he unfolded her most recent note, written during one of her rare lucid hours. "Live unafraid." It read in uneven strokes. He stared at the words until they blurred. How to live unafraid when everything he touched seemed to break. Grace's absence hollowed the office. He noticed it in the silence outside his door, in the empty chair at long meetings, in the absence of careful handwriting on case files. Her steadiness had been invisible until it was gone. Now every missing detail was a wound. His board pressed harder. Kingsley's voice grew sharper, demanding control, demanding compliance. "Distance yourself," they insisted. "Silence the rumors." But silence felt like betrayal, and betrayal felt unbearable. Ethan gripped the steering wheel, rain echoing on the metal roof. Grace had chosen sacrifice to protect him and Owen. Her resignation clarified what mattered. The company could not define love. Control could not erase truth. His decision formed in the quiet of the truck. The next move could not be private. It had to be spoken where power tried to choke it. It had to be lived in daylight. On Grace's nightstand, Owen's sketchbook lay open. Another lighthouse drawn in pencil. Beam steady across waves. Grace tucked him into bed, smoothing his hair, whispering that tomorrow would be better. She shut the door softly, then sat at the table with her hands around a chipped mug of tea. Her body ached, but her resolve was firm. She would carry both her sister's promise and her nephew's hope, even if it meant walking alone. In his truck, Ethan's phone vibrated with a calendar alert. The board would meet at dawn. He closed his mother's note carefully, placing it back in his pocket. Rain streaked the windshield like silver veins. He inhaled once, steadying himself, then turned the key. The engine rumbled to life, carrying him toward the storm he could no longer avoid. Reporters crowded the lobby of Pierce Harbor, cameras balanced on tripods, raincoats dripping onto marble. The air carried the sharp scent of wet wool and coffee brewed hours too early. Ethan Pierce entered through the side corridor, tie straightened not for courage, but for order. He no longer needed fabric to keep him upright. Upstairs, the boardroom buzzed with quiet tension. Stacks of binders lined the table, water bottles placed at each chair. Robert Kingsley stood near the head, silver hair combed flat, eyes narrowed like a hawk circling. Motion for a vote of no confidence. He announced as soon as Ethan took his seat. No greeting, no preamble. The strike was immediate. Ethan folded his hands on the table. Before the secretary could log the motion, he leaned forward. "I have a proposal first," he said, calm, steady, louder than the rain against the glass. He laid out the plan he had carried in his chest for weeks. A permanent Pierce Harbor caregiver fund, seeded with shares from his own portfolio. Policies to allow dignified family leave without fear of career loss. Micro-grants for employees crushed by medical bills. Legal clinics to guide guardians through courts that too often measured worth by income alone. The words fell into the room like stones into water, sending ripples no one could ignore. Kingsley slammed his palm on the table. "This is sentiment, not strategy. We have fiduciary duty. We answer to investors, not sob stories." Murmurs stirred around the table. Some nodded at Kingsley's sharpness. Others shifted uneasily, remembering their own private burdens. Ethan did not raise his voice. He spoke of numbers absenteeism caused by hidden caregiving, turnover from burnout, the cost of silence. But he returned always to people. "Compassion is not charity," he said. "It is infrastructure. We cannot expand our fleet if our crew is drowning. Still, the opposition held. Kingsley pressed hard. Your judgment is compromised. Your relationship with an employee has already endangered us. And now you offer us risk disguised as generosity. At the far end of the table, Lydia Bennett shifted her papers. The CFO's face was pale, lips tight. For years she had spoken only in figures, never in confessions. Now she cleared her throat. My husband has ALS, she said quietly. I've hidden it because I feared this room would not understand. But I cannot sit silent while we pretend caregiving is irrelevant to business. It has shaped every decision I've made, every late night, every number you've trusted. The boardroom stilled. Her disclosure cracked the shell of formality. What had been abstract became flesh. One by one, other statements surfaced. An executive assistant spoke of a father with dementia. A project manager mentioned a child's long hospital stay. Stories poured like water breaking through a dam. The room shifted from power to honesty. Then, the newest director, seated near the windows, lifted his gaze. Michael Kingsley. Robert's estranged son, appointed only last quarter, spoke with a voice that cut clean. My father is right about one thing. This is about duty. But duty without compassion is nothing more than control, and the cost of a compassionless culture is a company hollowed from within. The words hung heavy, not shouted, but undeniable. The secretary called the roll. The vote of no confidence failed by a slim margin. Ethan remained in his chair, not triumphant, only resolute. The caregiver fund passed. The new policies were adopted. The tide had turned not by his hand alone, but by the voices of many. Downstairs, reporters crowded closer, microphones raised. When Ethan stepped to the podium, flashbulbs flared. The narrative was waiting to be written. Scandal, romance, rebellion. He refused those frames. Our people carry more than workloads, he said. They carry families, illness, grief, and endurance. This company chooses to honor that. Today is not about image. It is about reality. The press scribbled, cameras clicked, but the angle shifted. Headlines would no longer scream of gossip in the rain. They would tell of culture changed in daylight. The twist was not his kiss, it was the chorus of voices demanding care. As the questions dwindled, Ethan looked straight into the cameras. His face held no mask, no polished distance. I won't call this a victory, he said. Not while the woman who showed me how to be human is no longer in this building. A hush followed. Rain tapped against the glass behind the press. For a moment, the story stood naked. Not scandal, not numbers, but love and loss, public and unashamed. The Atlantic is colder than the Sound. Grace had heard it before, but standing by the rocky shore, the wind cut deeper than she expected. Dawn turned the lighthouse white to gold, the light flashing steady over the sea. She held her sister's unmailed letter in her hand, crinkled and well-worn from time spent tucked in her coat pocket. It had been written long ago, in a time before illness, before grief had piled on top of all their plans. I know you'll keep your promise, her sister had written. Someday we'll see the lighthouse together. But now Grace stood alone, though Owen, her nephew, stood by her side, his small face lit by the early light. They had come to Maine to see the lighthouse, the one on the postcard, her sister's dream, now realized by Grace and Owen. They stayed in a simple inn in Bar Harbor, a place where no one cared to ask about yesterday or tomorrow. They walked the paths of Acadia, their boots crunching against the fallen leaves. Owen laughed, his steps light and free, as he picked up smooth stones from the paths, pocketing them like treasures. Grace smiled, but her heart was still, heavy with the quiet of the sea. When they arrived at Portland Head Light, the wind was stronger, biting at their cheeks. Grace let Owen lead the way, his eyes wide with wonder. She took a slow breath, standing back as he ran to the rocks, calling out with joy. It was beautiful, yes, but it was also a place where promises and silences could meet and be heard. The lighthouse beacon swept across the horizon, unwavering, constant. It was then that Ethan called. He had asked her to meet him there, but she had not expected him to follow. He stood at the base of the lighthouse, waiting, as if time had stopped for him too. He spoke of the caregiver fund again, of the work they had done, and the work still ahead. "The board," he said, voice low against the wind, "wants you to lead it. Grace, they trust you to be its founding director. Full independence, full oversight." Grace stared at the ocean, its waves crashing relentlessly against the rocks below. She could feel the weight of the decision settling in her chest. Her heart was torn between gratitude and fear. But there was something in Ethan's eyes, something more than duty or obligation. It was a promise, not a rescue. "I can't do this for you," she said softly, meeting his gaze. "You're not supposed to," Ethan replied, his voice steady. "You can do it for them. For yourself." She looked back at Owen, who had found another stone. His small hands held it up to the sun, a glint of light catching in the smooth surface. "I'll take it," she said quietly, more to herself than to Ethan. She wasn't just stepping into a role, she was accepting a calling. Her identity had been shaped by caregiving, by loss, by silence. But now, she was essential, not invisible anymore. Owen turned and ran toward them, holding the stone. "It's for Ethan's mom," he said, holding it out to Grace. She took it in her hand, its smooth surface warm against her skin. In his quiet way, Owen understood what was real. The decision was made. Grace was no longer a shadow in a corner. She was the light, the foundation of something that would change lives. She held the stone, feeling the weight of it, the symbolism of it in her palm. The lighthouse was no longer a dream deferred. It was a promise kept, a place where the past and future met. Ethan watched her closely, but he said nothing. He did not need to. She had made her choice, and it was hers alone. They stood together, side by side, as the lighthouse beams swept across the dark water. The waves struck the rocks below, relentless and sure. They were both standing, in their own ways. Grace had taken her place in the light. Ethan had found his way to the truth. The postcard promise was finally honored. Saturday mornings began with pancakes. Owen measured flour with the seriousness of a scientist, his brow furrowed as if a single grain out of place would ruin the batch. Grace stood beside him, guiding his hand but letting him lead. The kitchen smelled of butter and vanilla, the air warm with the sound of a child's laughter. On the fridge, a new certificate hung crooked outstanding effort from Owen's school. Every time Grace saw it, she smiled. It wasn't a prize for being perfect. It was a recognition of trying, and that was enough. The first grants from the Caregiver Fund had been sent out 2 weeks earlier, one to a woman juggling 2 jobs while supporting a brother through chemotherapy, another to a man caring for his aging father with Parkinson's. Grace read every letter, every application. Each one felt like a thread connecting her to strangers she somehow understood. She no longer carried the weight of her story alone. Legal clinics were scheduled in the old port building, its windows wide and drafty but full of light. Volunteers sat with families, explaining forms that once seemed designed to confuse. Support groups began to meet in church basements, circles of folding chairs filled with tired faces that softened as words spilled out. People cried, then laughed, then breathed easier, knowing they were not alone. Grace attended the first circle. She did not speak much, only listened. When she finally shared her own story, she saw nods around the room. It felt like setting down a stone she had carried too long. She kept the lighthouse postcard on her desk at the fund office. It reminded her that even small dreams, like standing by the sea with family, could anchor a life. Ethan's mother kept the smooth white stone on her bedside table. Some days she didn't remember Ethan's name, but she hummed an old tune when her fingers closed around the stone. Ethan told Grace about it one evening, his voice soft. "She holds it like a promise," he said. Grace understood. Promises had weight, but also light. Guardianship for Owen was finalized that spring. The court approved it without hesitation. Grace left the building with Owen's hand tucked firmly in hers, relief steady in her chest. That night, she enrolled him in a robotics club he had been begging to join. The look on his face when he held the welcome packet was worth every late night and every sacrifice. At Pierce Harbor, change moved slowly but surely. Managers received training to spot burnout, to ask questions without judgment. Employees whispered less in hallways and spoke more in meetings. The culture had begun to shift, not with grand speeches but with steady daily acts of care. Retention numbers climbed higher than the previous year, proof written in charts that compassion worked as strategy. Ethan's schedule no longer ruled him the way it once had. He still traveled, still closed deals, but he made time to walk the harbor with Grace and Owen on Sundays. They bought ice cream even when the wind bit cold. They let Owen race ahead, his laughter scattering across the dock. It wasn't about grand gestures anymore. It was about rhythm restored. One evening, Grace sat at her new desk in the fund office, long after the building had gone quiet. The postcard was pinned above her lamp, its edges worn but steady. She thought of her sister, of the promise finally honored. She thought of Ethan, of the risk he had taken to stand in front of the boardroom and refuse to hide. She thought of Owen, asleep at home with a science kit waiting on the table for morning. She exhaled slowly, realizing that life had taken on a new texture, not the frantic blur of survival, not the ache of invisibility, but something quieter, something that felt like home. The next morning, a headline appeared in the business section: Pierce Harbor expansion moves forward, with stronger retention than last year. No mention of scandal, no mention of rumors. The story framed care not as liability, but as strength. Grace read the article once, then folded it neatly and tucked it into her drawer. She did not need proof from the paper. She had proof in pancakes, in certificates on the fridge, in circles of caregivers sharing burdens together. She had proof in her own reflection, no longer invisible, but steady, essential, seen. The quiet victory was not in charts or headlines. It was in rhythm restored. At the ferry terminal, 1 year later, the rain returned. It was not harsh this time, not a storm to fear, but a steady hymn against the glass and steel of the pier. Commuters hurried past, umbrellas tilted, shoes splashing. For Grace, the sound was almost familiar, almost kind. She stood with Owen and Ethan by the waterfront rail. The evening light was dim, blurred by mist. The air smelled of salt and wet asphalt, sharp and clean. It felt like the city had turned itself inside out and found its softer voice. This night was an anniversary, not of a date on paper, not of a contract signed, but of a moment when rain had refused to let her hide, when a kiss had made two people stop pretending they were only roles. 1 year had passed, yet the memory was as near as breath. Ethan carried a small wooden box, polished smooth, engraved with a lighthouse. He set it on the bench between them, water beading on its lid. Inside, nestled against fabric, was a folded note, his mother's best one, the one she had written on a lucid day: "Live unafraid." Beside it lay a single blank card. At the top, Ethan had written in neat block letters, "What we will live next." No lines beneath, only space. Grace touched the card with her fingertips. Her breath caught. The weight of silence pressed, but it was not heavy. It was room. Room for tomorrow. Room for small choices that carried the shape of devotion. Owen leaned close, curious. He slipped his hand on top of Grace's. Ethan covered them both with his own. 3 hands together, warm despite the damp air. The simple stack of touch felt stronger than any speech. They did not speak of grand vows, no castles, no riches, no promises carved too sharp. Instead, they spoke of the ordinary, school programs where Owen might show his projects, clinic nights where Grace would sit with families facing the same forms she once feared, evenings when Ethan would leave the office early, not to escape, but to arrive home. The rain was not the enemy now. It was a reminder. It tapped on the pavement, shone in the streetlights, rinsed the day clean. It said, begin again and again and again. Ethan opened the box once more, letting Grace see the note and the card together. "The past gave us courage," he said softly. The future will ask for faith. Grace nodded. Her heart no longer beat in panic when she thought of tomorrow. It beat steady, even when it ached. Loss had carved its mark, but love had filled the hollow. Owen tugged her sleeve. "Can I write the first thing he asked?" pointing at the blank card. Grace smiled through damp lashes. Of course. He borrowed her pen and scrawled with uneven letters, "Go back to the lighthouse in summer." Ethan laughed, a quiet sound carried off by the wind. Grace's throat tightened, not with grief this time, but with a warmth she had almost forgotten was possible. They stood like that until the ferry horn blew a low, deep note rolling over water. Commuters gathered at the gate. The wet pavement gleamed like silver under the lamps. Life went on, steady as tide. Grace placed the lighthouse postcard into the box beside the note and the card. A circle closed, not an ending, but a promise folded small enough to carry. The lid clicked shut, the rain kept falling, and here is where the story belongs. Listener, not in scandal, not in whispered gossip, but in the choice that repeats itself every morning, to love when it is easier not to care when success shouts louder, to redefine both, not as rivals, but as companions. What would you choose, love or success? Or will you dare to believe they can be the same? When you choose to live with care, the foghorn sounded again. The rain kissed their shoulders, and the box stayed closed, carrying its promise forward into tomorrow. Life often teaches us through storms. Grace and Ethan's story is not about power, wealth, or even romance. In the usual sense, it is about the quiet courage to be real. Both carried invisible burdens, unpaid bills, fading memory, the ache of promises broken by time. For years, they hid behind work, behind silence, believing survival was enough. But the rain stripped away their defenses, and in that raw moment they discovered something simple yet profound. Love and care are not weaknesses. They are strength. For those of us who have lived long enough to know loss, this lesson is clear. True success is not measured in titles or in the size of our homes. It is found in the people who hold our hands when the world turns cold, in the small mercies we give and receive, in the steady rhythm of ordinary days made sacred by care. You do not need to wait for a storm to choose differently. You can begin today by listening, by offering kindness, by letting others help you carry what feels too heavy. In the end, the bravest act is not hiding your heart, but allowing it to be seen. Thank you, dear friends, for staying with us until the very end of this story. We hope it touched your heart and reminded you of the quiet strength found in love, care, and second chances. If this journey spoke to you, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing more stories of hope and healing to life. Until next time, may you carry kindness with you wherever you go.